Jai Mahamaya ki jai, Vishveshvari Mata ki jai. We'll go on with chapter 42 from the Devi Bhagavatam retold. Janamejaya objected, but Ravata was a Kshatra. How could he go to Brahmaloka where only Brahmanas who know the Brahman may come, or men who have died and left their gross bodies behind them? Vedavyasa said, above golden Mount Sumeru are Indra's heavens and his city of Amravati, the abode of those who do not die. But in ancient times, men of the earth were so like the immortals, they also journeyed freely to the subtler realms. Why, your great-grandfather, Kunti's son Arjuna, traveled to Devaloka in the Vimana and stayed there with Indra for 5 years. The ancient king Kakutstha went as he pleased to Devaloka in his human body. Once the king Mahabhishek was flying to Brahmaloka when he saw Ganga also traveling there by the paths of the air. The wind parted her garment that she wore, and the king was smitten by lust to glance at her exquisite nakedness. She noticed his intention and smiled at him, for she also desired that mighty king. Then Brahma cursed them both to be born on earth again as a mortal king and his wife. So, O Janamejaya, Ravata was by no means the first or last Kshatriya who traveled to Brahmaloka along the pathways of the sky. When they arrived in Brahmasabha there was unearthly music playing, and the king and his daughter sat entranced by it for a very long time. When the music stopped, Ravata bowed deeply to Brahma and said, Lord, this is my daughter, Ravati. I have come to beg you to find the right groom for her. Let him be a Kshatriya, my lord, good-natured and invincible. For a moment, Brahma gazed at the beautiful Ravati and at her father. Then he laughed softly and said, Ravata, 108 yugas have passed in the world while you listened to my musicians playing. It is the 27th Dwapara Yuga now on earth. I'm afraid all the Kshatriyas of your clan are long dead. The demons attacked your city and sacked it many times. But now the Yadava king, Ugrasena, rules from your city and is called Dwarka. It is a long story, Ravata, but an avatar of Lord Vishnu has been born into the world to rid the earth of her burdens of evil. He is called Krishna, and he has come to break the power of the race of the Kshatriyas forever. You see, it is the end of the Dwapara Yuga, and the Kali Yuga is rising over the earth. Vishnu's rest, Anantashaya, has been born as Krishna's mighty brother, Balarama. This Balarama will make the perfect husband for your child. Take her to him and let them be man and wife. You have my blessings. The stunned Ravata bowed again to his Pitamaha and flew down to the earth. He could hardly recognize it, for its luster had faded so abjectly in this evil time. Then Balarama, when they saw him, he was magnificent, and he was delighted to make the lovely Ravati for his wife. After the wedding, Ravata made his way slowly to Bhadra Ashrama, where he at last found his peace. Vedavyasa said. Janamejaya cried, but how astonishing, Muni, that 108 yugas passed while Ravata and Ravati listened to the music in Brahma's court. How do they live so long? Vedavyasa said, Brahmaloka is a sinless realm. There is no sickness or death there, not even weariness. When Saryati was in Brahmaloka, the Rakshasas killed many of his sons. Those that escaped fled Kushathala in every direction and hid themselves in the ends of the earth. Meanwhile, Sarati's elder brother, Ishvaku, was king in Ayodhya. Bhikukshi was his eldest son. He sent 50 of his sons, Sukuni and the others, to the northern eastern parts of Bharata Varsha to rule in his name. He sent another 8 sons to the south and kept 2 princes beside him to help him. Once the time of the Astaka Shraddha came around, and Ishvaku sent his son Vikukshi into the forest to fetch fresh meat for the sacrifice in the name of the dead ancestors. Now the meat used in a sacrifice must be perfectly clean. Bhikshuki hunted a while in the Vana, and he gathered all sorts of animals, boars, deers, rabbits, and fowl. But suddenly he felt powerful pangs of hunger, and he roasted and ate 1 rabbit from the many he had hunted. Bhikshuki came home with the rest of the meat, but when it was brought to Vasishtha, the Kalguru knew that at once that a portion of it had already been eaten, making the rest leavings. The Shastras clearly say that leftovers are never to be used as sacrificial offerings. Vasishtha told the king that the meat his son had brought was tainted. Ishvaku flew into rage and banished Bhikukshi from his kingdom. Then on the prince was known as Sasada, and he was content, living in the forest among the rishis, from whom he learned prayer, wisdom, and restraint. When Ikshvaku died, Bhikukshi inherited his father's kingdom. Sasada himself had 1 son called Kakutsha, or Indravaha, or Puranjaya. Janamejaya said, "Tell me how that Kshatra had 3 names." When Sasada left this world, Kakusta became king of the house of the sun. He was a powerful sovereign, a great bhakta, and a man of perfect dharma. In those days, Indra and his devas were routed in battle by some asuras and driven out from Amravati. They fled to Vishnu and begged him to help him. Vishnu said, "Ishvaku's grandson, Kakutsha, is a Kshatriya upon the earth. Go and ask him to help you against the demons. He worships Parashakti and has great powers by the Divine Mother's blessings." Indra and his luminous group came to Ayodhya, and the king received them reverently. When they were seated in the majestic Sabha, he said to the other ones of light, "My lords, I am 3 times blessed that you have come to my city. Tell me, how can I serve you?" The Devas replied, "Great Kshatriya, the Asuras have driven us from Amravati. We have come to seek your help against them." Kakutsha considered this for a moment, then said with a smile, "It is a difficult task you assign to me, but I will come to fight the demons if Indra will bear me into battle upon his back." Indra was startled. He was outraged. But then he had to agree, or the king of the earth would not come to fight for him. Indra became a great bull, and mounted on his back, Kakusta went into battle against the Asuras. By the Devi's grace, he was invincible, and the demons were slaughtered. Since Indra became a bull, a Kakuta, and the Ishvaku king rode on his back, he was known from then on as Kakutsa. For Indra having been his mount, he was called Indravasa, and since he vanquished the Asuras, who are the first race of creation, he was called Puranjaya. Karaksa's son was the legendary Prithu, lord of the earth, who was a Amsavatara of Mahavishnu. Prithu's son was Vishvarandi, and his son was called Chandra. One of Chandra's sons, who became king after him, was called Yuvanshva, and his son was Savanta the pious. Savanta built a city called Savanti, and it was like an Amravati on the earth. Savanta's son, who ruled after him, was Kuvalayasva, who killed the demon Dandu, who had overrun the world. That king became celebrated as Dandumara. Dridasva was Dandumara's son, and his son was Sriman Haryava. Haryasva's son was Nikumba, who was also a king. Varhanasva was Nikumba's son, and Krisaba was his son. Krisaba's son was called Prasandajit, and he sired Yavansava, whose son was Sriman Mandata. The great Mandata built 1,008 palaces in the name of the Divine Mother, Devi Bhagavati, in Varanasi, and the other most sacred tirthas. It is told Mandata was not born of his mother's womb, but from his father's belly. King Janamacharya said, "Passing strange. How can a man be born from his father's belly?" Mandhata's father, Yavansava, had 100 queens, but he had no sons. He was obsessed by this lack. The king performed 100 yagas in his palace, yet his wives did not get an heir. Finally, in despair, the king went into a deep jungle where the holiest rishi sat in tapasya. He flung himself down at their feet and wept. The Brahmanas asked him gently, "What grieves you, Kshatriya, that you cry like this?" The king said, "Munis, there is nothing in this world that I do not have as a king of the house of the sun. I have vast lands, immense wealth, power, and 100 chaste queens. I have no enemies in the world, for there is no one that is stronger than me. I am indeed a king of kings, but holy ones, God has not blessed me with a son. My lords, my kingdom has no heir. I will do anything to have a son. Help me." The rishis were moved, and they undertook a putra kama yagya for the king in his city. They performed the sacrifice in the name of Indra, lord of the Devas. They filled an earthen vessel with sacred water and blessed it with powerful Vedic mantras. The water vessel was left overnight in the Yagyashala, but that night the king awoke with a hot thirst searing him. He staggered about in the darkness, but found no water to drink anywhere. Then he saw the water in the sacrificial vessel glimmering by a slender moon that had risen. Hardly knowing what he did, the king picked up the vessel and drained the holy water in it. Then he went back to sleep and dreamt brilliant dreams. The next morning, the rishis saw how the water vessel was empty and were aghast. They said, "King, who drank this sacred water?" Shamefaced, the king said, "I think I did, my lords, but I hardly knew what I was doing. I was so thirsty." The rishis conferred amongst themselves briefly and decided this was a divine act of fate. They completed the yagya and returned to their ashrams. In some weeks, the king's belly began to swell, and he realized that he had become pregnant himself with the water he drank. All his ministers and peoples, his queens and family were astonished. But when his time came, the king went into labor. His physician incised his right bowel, and from it delivered a fine infant son. By God's grace, the king himself did not die, but recovered fully from his extraordinary confinement. But now, who would suckle that little prince? It is told that Indra himself reached his forefinger down into the bright child's mouth and the child sucked on it and was nourished. Thus he had his name Mandata, which means my finger, and said Vedavyasa to the Kuru king Janamejaya. Jai Mahamaya ki jai, Vishveshwari Mata ki jai, Bule Baba ki jai.